Hey friends, I'm Abigail.
And I'm Cassidy, and this is 10 to Thrive.
We're here to talk through all the seasons of life.
From the messy and mundane to the meaningful, where God meets us where we are.
We're all about applying God's Word to real life and growing as women of God together.
Let's thrive in His goodness for His glory. Hey friends, it's Cassidy here, and today we're chatting with Abigail about entering the wilderness. And speaking of Abigail, I had so much fun looking through the album that you sent over. She did my pictures for my boys and I last week, and I was so excited to see those. Those were beautiful.
And that's the best compliment that I can get, that you're excited.
Yes, I was like sitting over there scrolling through. I'm like, I'm crying. It's so beautiful. I'm like so glad that we were able to do that.
Well, yeah, I'm glad that it worked out, and I don't know, it's a hobby. I would say that's a hobby. I am a terrible businesswoman when it comes down to things, but I always say I love the art over the business. And so just being able to do it and have fun, I think it's great.
Appreciate that. We're going to be chatting a little bit about entering the wilderness and some in-between seasons. And most often, an in-between season or a wilderness is found straight out of high school or straight out of college, and trying to discover like where we're at. But it also kind of hits us even going from singleness to marriage, or from no kids to having kids, and we're tossed into it. And so the wilderness is somewhere that we can learn from the Israelites, where they're wandering and finding direction in their lives. So if you want to take it away for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we get into this, it really first hit me. I started this year doing a read through the Bible in chronological order, and the verse that stood out to me, Exodus chapter 13, verse 17. Let's see, it says, "And it came to pass when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God led them not through the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest peradventure the people repent when they see war, and they return to Egypt. But God led the people through the way of the wilderness and the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up harnessed out of the land of Egypt." And that stood out to me because I realized that immediately off the bat, God took the people the long way. He took them the hard way. And so a couple months ago, I guess it was probably the end of January or February when I was reading that, and I just started meditating on, what kind of detours does God give us in our time of need? But as we really hop into this idea of the wilderness, like Cassidy said, there are going to be seasons where we're really confused. So we're going to look at Israel's history a little bit and make some modern day application. So the first point that we have is the immediate detour. As the people were leaving Egypt, and they were probably getting really excited about the prospect of new lives and freedom, the Lord didn't take them the most direct route.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes getting out of high school can feel that way, right? Where you finish up and you're like, woohoo, now I get to start my life and
adulthood.
Yeah, and it's not always the most direct route. Some people decide to take a gap year in between school. Some people hop right into school. Some people never go to school. I know that for me personally, I graduated high school and I had set my sight on, okay, I'm going to become an EMT and I'm going to be doing inner city ministry and yada, yada, yada. But before I did that, I ended up going to India with my brother and sister-in-law, and I spent 6 months there. And that was kind of, I guess in a way, a wilderness season where I was wandering and having an awesome adventure and loving that season of life, before starting to make my trek into what I thought would be my career. And later on, down the road, I found out, EMS is not my career. But that can kind of be a detour that comes up right away.
Yeah, it sounds like very familiar. Like a lot of us have that story. It's like, well, we hopped out of high school, we thought we had a plan, and then you hop into something else and you're like, this isn't exactly where I thought I was heading, and it can feel a little bit scary being on a detour, being on the in-betweens.
Yeah, and that detour could be something else too. Like it could be an illness that unexpectedly comes. That happened to my husband. We took a missions trip to Peru in that summer before he was going into college, and then he ended up with an E. coli, and he had these grand plans of being a starter on the football team and all these different things. Well, he was so weak for the entire training camp season that he wasn't able to get established, positionally where he would have loved, and it definitely slowed him down. By the end of the season, he was in a lot more, but that was kind of a wilderness for him in a way. And you might each have a different wilderness that you say, wow, this is a detour I was not expecting. But we're going to look into why.
Right.
Why did God have this detour that he just threw at them? And I could find at least 4 reasons.
Okay.
I love digging into things.
Yes, let's hear 'em.
And so I like making lists. Number 1, he knew them better than they knew themselves. Right? At this point, the Israelites, they were in their infant stage, and they didn't really know what they were made of yet. But God did. He knew them better than they knew themselves, and so he said, wait a second, let's
You're
go.
not ready for this yet.
We're going to take it easy, all right? We're going to start off with a slow pitch here. He didn't want them to be afraid. He knew going through the Philistines' land was going to be harsh. And if we pause the story right here and then fast forward, we know that they did. A year later, when they were supposed to conquer the Philistines and the Amalekites and go up, they were too afraid and they didn't do it. And so God said, okay, we're not going to go back to Egypt yet. Hold your horses. Let's take a detour. So he knew them better than they knew themselves. He didn't want them to be afraid. He didn't want them to get discouraged. And this is really cool to me when we oftentimes get discouraged by detours. I hate driving and then being like,
Turn around.
I have to, turn around. And Cassidy knows this really well by now. I am late all the time. I was on time today, though.
Yes, she texts me. She's like, I'm going to be on time today.
I left the house on time. But usually that's not me. And so then when I hit a detour, I'm like, oh no, I'm going to be really late. But God gave them this detour so they wouldn't be discouraged. He didn't want them to be afraid right off the bat. He had a better plan for them. He didn't want them to go immediately into war. The reality is, all of these weary slaves leaving Egypt would have been going immediately into war. And God didn't want that. He wanted them to have a little bit of a break before they started the battling.
Like, they would even be underprepared, like not having the tools and supplies to defend themselves. And so that's really like, go on God's part. Like, he knew ahead of time that they couldn't handle that. And even a lot of the fact that they're relearning how to live their lives. They're coming from slavery into this freedom. They don't even know how to properly rest. And God gives them that command. Like, you guys need to learn how to rest. And so there's lots that they have to relearn, and God is taking them through that with a detour.
And I love what you had to say about freedom. We're going to start to get a little sidetracky here, but the idea that they didn't know what that freedom was like. And again, going back into the idea, if you are graduating high school, and maybe even if you're graduating college, you might not totally know what freedom feels like. And it can be a little wild at first when you have all of that dropped on you. Hopefully, you have been practicing freedom with responsibility as you've been growing into adulthood. But sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes individuals haven't really learned the responsibility aspect of freedom, and that was certainly the case of the Israelites. They finally had freedom, but they didn't really understand the responsibility that went with it. Can you think of some reasons why, literally or figuratively, a detour might be a good thing?
Yeah, I think that God saw it as a good thing, and maybe they didn't feel like this was the good and the best thing for them. But sometimes it's accepting that this is God's best, and he gives us good things. And I was reminded in a verse of Psalms 34:10, where it says, when we seek him, we lack no good thing. And again in James 1:17, it says, every good and perfect gift is from above. Or even thinking about Matthew 7:11, comparing as a father gives good gifts to his children, God is going to give us good things. And so maybe it didn't feel like a good idea to them to have a detour, but God was going to be teaching them through this, and it was for their ultimate good. And I think that's kind of where I landed with talking about detours. Is like, why, God? Why would you do this for us? It's because God saw this was a best fit for them. But yeah, I wanted to hop into going, like, why did they have to go through the wilderness? And I think you have a couple of good things for us with going through.
Yeah, so our next big point then is the plan was always to go through the wilderness. I know that sometimes we think, okay, I can just avoid this season of life. I can totally avoid X, Y, and Z. And I think even sometimes when we look at Israel's history, we get a little bit confused about the whole wilderness aspect. And we think like, oh, they were never supposed to be there in the first place. And that's not true. Actually, it was always God's plan for them to go through. Exodus 14:1-3. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, speak unto the children of Israel, that they turn and encamp before Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, over against Baal-zephon, before you will encamp by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, they're entangled in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. And so God is preparing them to go through. And he's saying, okay, you're going to take this route and go through here. And then Pharaoh is going to think he's so smart and that he has you trapped in the wilderness. So I think that we've made the argument here. Yes, okay, the wilderness is not always a bad place to be. Sometimes God gives us detours. He gives us the scenic route. You know, how nice.
Is it wonderful that God gave him a roadmap right there? This is where you're going to go, and then you're going to go here, and this is all part of my plan.
Right. Now, we don't always get that roadmap, but we can know that he has one for us.
Yes.
So the people, they needed to cross the wilderness to get to the promised land. The wilderness was standing between the people and their new beginning. And every step through the wilderness seemed to be an act of faith for the people. So when we look at this wilderness season, God intends it for us. He desires us to go there as a faith builder. And I found 9 different faith steps that the people had to take. If you really apply yourself, you're going to find way more than 9. You're going to find like 9D. But the first faith step that I saw was that they were trapped by the Egyptians. So they didn't have to face the Amalekites in war, but they were trapped by the Egyptians. And what did God do?
He brought them through.
He brought them through. He opened up the Red Sea. And so right away, he allows them to have this dilemma, and then he reveals himself through it. And we know that the parting of the Red Sea is probably one of the most well-known miracles throughout the Bible, and it should be. That is really one of the foundational aspects of God's relationship with his people, but it only happened when they were between a rock and a hard place. And it only happened when they were entering into that wilderness. So you might be entering into a wilderness season right now, and your season might be, I have been a stay-at-home mom for the last 10 years, and I feel like I'm just wandering aimlessly. When is this season going to end? And God is saying, hey, I want you here. There are faith-building steps that you need to take. And maybe you are halfway through, or maybe you're at step 9 of 10. You know, we don't know what God's plan is, but we do know that he wants us here, at least for a season. So the next thing that they came across after being in the wilderness, they crossed through the Red Sea, is they didn't have water. And so now they're having to cry out, and they're starting to complain, get a bad attitude. It didn't take very long, unfortunately. but they had no water. And then the Lord provides water. And next, they had no food. And what did the Lord provide? Food. He provided the manna. He provided the quail. See, I told Cassidy, I was like, I'm just going to start asking you questions. And she was like, no, don't do it.
I'll give you the Sunday school answers.
Yeah, so you guys can follow along in the audience. Who can answer first? Just kidding, Cassidy.
My brain is going to blank.
Cassidy's like, no, my anxiety. Please don't do this. All right.
Good.
So then the Lord miraculously provides the food. And so he's showing himself through all of this. And unfortunately, for the most part, the people aren't looking at this as a really cool object lesson. Unfortunately, they're not looking at this as their hidden garden where they're finding fruit to be cultivated. They're looking at this as like a boring field trip that they're stuck on.
It's just like kind of the thing that's in my brain is like, just keeps poking at me is, what if God wanted them to ask? What if he was like sitting there and putting them in a trial like, I want them to ask me for water. I want them to ask me for the manna or for food, something that they really needed.
Right.
Because we all depend on water and food. And maybe he was just like, I want them to come to me and I want them to ask. And maybe that came across as complaining.
Yeah.
But I mean, they had to ask.
Exactly. I mean, it's not like God was like, oh, I didn't realize you needed to eat. My bad. Like, I think that you make a very good point there that he fully expected them to ask. But I think that he probably, like you alluded to, desired them to ask in a more humble way. So no food, no civilization. They did not have other people groups that they could rely on and cohabitate with. Again, they came out of Egypt. That's what they were familiar with. They were familiar with having this city and having a pretty industrialized area, and now they're nomads. We, I think, kind of lose sight of that because we do think of the Israelites a little bit as a nomadic people or shepherding people, but up until this point, most of them weren't. You know, they were not used to this. They were city people moving to the country, and I think that it was really, really hard for them. So that was a faith step. And maybe that's where you are. Maybe right now you're listening and you're about to move across the country, or you're about to move from the city to the country, or the country to the city. That was my experience. I went from living in the country to living in the city, or it's not really the city, but living in town.
Yeah.
And that was hard for me. It was weird. I was like,
Same.
yeah, people are looking at my
Everyone's
windows.
so close.
Yes, why are they so close to me? All right. And that can be very uncomfortable, and you might have a hard time and be saying, God, why do we have to live here? You know, why does this have to be my house? Instead of saying, wow, thank you, God, for giving me a house.
I feel attacked. This was me yesterday, actually. I had let a complaint slip out. I'm like, Alex, everyone's too close to our house. Learning contentment and patience.
Yeah.
Good season.
Faith steps, right?
Yes.
This is your wilderness, Cassidy. Pausing the journey. So throughout their journey, God had, we talked about at the beginning, how he had multiple stops for them to take along the way. And that was probably a little frustrating for the people, being like, oh, we just want to get to the promised land. Why do we have to keep stopping? I remember growing up, going on road trips or whatever. I just wanted to get to the destination. Right. I was not a let's have a fun time. I was like, no, we are going from point A to point B. And
are we there yet?
Yes, that was me. And, you know, God just says, hey, take your time. I have some things to show you along the way. Then they had to wait for their leader when he went up to the mountain. And they were waiting and feeling like, well, maybe he died. You know, maybe he abandoned us and he's tired of us. And so they decide to start doing things their own way. Then they had lots of sin and disobedience, and they had to take responsibility for that and be held accountable for that. I think that took a lot of growing. And then finally, their faith step is going into war against a daunting enemy. And again, if we take it into kind of our context, your daunting enemy might be who knows what. It might be facing the terrible twos. It might be potty training. You know, I don't know what your terrible enemy is right now. But God has called us, hey, you need to do this. I need you to take this step, and I need you to trust in me.
Yeah, that reminds me of a refining process. And actually, like, sometimes you have to go through it, and it takes time and patience, and God is always right on time.
Yeah.
And he's going to take us through this, and just with those faith steps that we're going to have to trust in him and lean on him through the wilderness. Do you ever think that the Israelites thought that God had forgotten about them? Like when on Mount Sinai, God was with Moses on the mountain, and they were down below, and they were forgetting about God himself, and they're like, maybe God has just forgotten about us altogether. Is Moses ever going to be coming back to us?
Right.
So maybe if we could step into that a little bit.
Yeah, I think to an extent, I think that they thought that. I think what's almost more likely is that they thought God didn't understand them. And I think that maybe they were under the impression that the gods of Egypt did. And they were able to look and say, hey, you know, there's a God for this and a God for that, and we can hold this God, and we can, you know, pray to this God, and we can physically see this idol, versus this God, he seems kind of far away. I don't think he's as relational. I don't think that he gets us the same way.
Right.
And so
that could be a battle that they had between being in a different country with all of these different gods, but then they did get to see God displaying his power through the plagues, and they had to, in faith, put the blood on the doorposts for the angel of the Lord to pass over their houses. So in some way, it's like, well, they were God's people. They did know who God was, but maybe they had just completely been mixing what they had known and grown up with in the land of Egypt. So that can make sense.
Yeah, I think that there was a lot of confusion. When Moses went up to the mountain, you know, maybe they kind of felt like, well, God is with Moses. He's not with me.
Right.
And again, I think that we can feel that way. So in a way, maybe they did think, oh, he's forgotten about us. He's with his golden child, you know.
Yeah.
And I think we can sometimes have that same attitude of, oh, God is
for
just
them,
too
but
busy
not for me.
Yeah, blessing them.
Yeah, so I was thinking about where are other passages that we see God's wilderness, or the wilderness, not God's wilderness, but is with David, where he was tossed into a wilderness season when God had promised that he would be the king, and he had to sit in the waiting while Saul was actively coming after him, and he sits in this terrible wilderness. It's terrifying. But we see him in Psalms 13, verse 1. It says, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? And maybe you're in a wilderness season, and maybe you feel like God's forgotten you. He's not forgotten you. He might feel far because the trials can feel really daunting and really tough. But God was working in David's life and solidifying his faith, preparing him. And God can use wilderness to write our stories. And he's a good author. He used David's wilderness to write the Psalms. And without this wilderness of David's life, we wouldn't have that wonderful book that we get to go even when we're just craving some relief from our trials. And we can see David crying out to God in a lot of those seasons. So I just thought that was an interesting point, thinking about wilderness.
Yeah, I love that you brought up David, and I love that you brought up the Psalms, which really does bring us into kind of the next sub point of the plan was always to go through the wilderness. Many of the Psalms were written while David was in the wilderness. Well, we know that the law was given while the Israelites were in the wilderness. So there are some really important stops that God wanted the people to make. The longest stop, and what was supposed to be the final stop before entering the land, was Mount Sinai. And here the people were to receive and learn the law. So at this point, the people have been wandering for about 11 months. Okay, so they're in the tail end of what they're supposed to be there for, and God gives them the law. And his desire through the law was for them to learn. So there are a few different things that the law teaches them and can teach us. The law teaches us that we're sinners. It let the Israelites know, hey, you have a sin problem. It taught us and the Israelites, what is God like? It gave them an idea and a realization that God is holy. He is totally different from these Egyptian gods. God was making it very clear that I am. I am not them. It teaches us what's in our heart.
Yeah.
You know, you don't need to be told something that you naturally want to do. You don't need to be told to drink water. Well, some of us need to be told to drink water, but in general, that is a natural instinct that we have, is I need to drink water, I need to eat food, but we do have to be told not to lie. And that's because we have a lying heart inside of us that wants to hide and cover up. The law teaches us how to treat others, and it teaches us that we cannot save ourselves. So this stop was incredibly important. And while you are in your wilderness season, know that it's incredibly important for you to be here. It's not just an aimless waiting season of nothingness. This is a really, really important, pivotal season that God wants you to go through, wants you to walk through. And he has something very valuable that he wants you to take from it.
Yeah.
So we see the wilderness then was extremely important and extremely intentional on God's part.
All right, so we're actually realizing that our conversation here is quite lengthier than we had planned for. There's so much to dig in. So we're actually going to pause right here and kind of cap out, and you can catch part 2 for our next week's episode. But before we hop into some more conversation, I want to close this out with our usual song of the week. Yes, and so I think we're going to go with, it's called Narrow Road by Chris Renzema. I might be saying that completely wrong, his last name.
Idea.
But it's called Narrow Road. I'll add that to our Spotify playlist, and so if you want to go and find the playlist, it's actually linked in our Instagram bio. That's where we share weekly content about our episodes and encouraging things as we think about it. So yeah, if you want to find us over there, we're at tend.thrive on Instagram. But yeah, it was great talking to you today, Abigail, and I'm excited to see what else we have for next week's episode.
All right, bye.
Bye.